Okay, so before we get to the Gemara, actually, and we're in Samach Daled and Amid Beis, we talked last week about what the halach is, and that as far as certain things go. So I thought what we would, I just give you a brief um, statement or overview from the Yeridea Hilchos Ribbis, which is fairly extensive. I mean, it goes on and talks about Ribbis Bayanakum and all other kinds of conditions, which the Gemara hasn't addressed here at this point. But I thought that it would be worthwhile just to see inside um, how the halacha plays out, because we've talked about the halacha on ribbis being very, very, it's a strenuous, it's a stern halacha. So you'll see from the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch. So just a few of the sifim, just to give us a flavor. Tzarich lahazir beribis. We have to be extremely zohir, careful beribis. V'kama lavin nemru bo, and how many losas, how many lavin are associated with it. Va'afilo halvo hanosno va'ore va'edim oivrim. So, in which we said that every party to the ribis is considered a, a part and parcel of the ribis, and and I'm just if it says it here in the Agos, but the halacha is that even the sofer who writes the shtar for ribbis is also included in the Isser. So that really gives you a strong flavor of how far it goes. I'm hearing some kind of an echo. Is that me, Menashe?
It was Jay. I muted him.
Okay. All right. So now, so we said is every party. So now the Hagor says ve'in chiluk bein im malve lo'oni v'osher, which we said it doesn't matter if you loan it to an oni or an osher. The halacha is the same. That that mehilchas malve v'ho delover over dafke beribis deraisa. And again, the halacha states very clearly that it's ribits deraisa, which we defined in the Gemara. We said ribis katsutza, which means that you have a prearranged ribis, and of course that excludes the other cases in the Gemara where he lends him, he pledges a field, and then can he eat the peiros? Because those other things are not ribis katsutza; they're ribis derabanan, but they're not ribis katsutza, because ribis katsutza is specifically making an arrangement at the outset that I'm going to give you X and you're going to give me Y, and Y is more than X. So that's really, he said, v'dafka b'ribis deraisa, avla b'ribis derabanan, eina oive ele mishum lifnei iver. Ribis derabanan, says the halacha, is really a lifnei iver. So it sort of casts a little bit of a different understanding, is that you're not even doing ribis. What you're doing is you're over the lav of lifnei iver, which is a lav de oraisa. So that's what the halacha is saying, that the ribis de rabbanon turns out to be an iser de oraisa of lifnei iver, which we didn't have. The Gemara didn't speak that out. Ribis Rabbanan, okay, and we know Ribis Rabbanan you do not have to pay back, and it's not considered as strong or as stern as Ribis Deraisa, but the Halacha Hagah says, but you're over with Iver, okay? So that's an interesting note. Kolanosim beribis, and now he goes on further. Anyone who operates with ribis, nechosav mutatim, his nechosim will lessen. In other words, you think that you're going to get a break by getting a couple extra dollars. The exact opposite will happen, says the halacha, that it will be memuat. Gilu kofer b'mitzias mitzrayim ba'olei Yisrael. And this, how powerful this language is, and we know from the Gemara that ribbis is strong, but the halacha says that by doing ribbis, you're denying Yitzias Mitzrayim Elokei Yisrael. So I wanted to read that from the halacha, because this is halacha lemaisa now, that it puts a very, very strong stamp on ribis and impropriety. Hatayla ma'osav lomer shehem shel oivdei kochavim. And now again, we had this in the Gemara as well. If someone wants to do a sleight of hand and he wants to lend it and says, "No, this is money of an oived kochavim," umalvos and beribis hakadosh baruch hu yifrim mimenu. Now, okay, so in other words, you sort of sleight of hand. What happens if the guy owes you money? In other words, it's not you're not just giving money to the Ovid Chachavim, rather the other way, you owe the Chachavim. You know, it's not just, you said to the guy, here's my money, lend it to this guy, and we'll get more money back. But even if he gives him the return of a chayv, let's say the guy lent him money, and he went ahead and said, okay, I'm giving you a couple extra bucks, which Pialacha is not a problem. And then he says, but you know what? Do me a favor. Now that you have the money, lend it to so and so. So, in other words, so that money really belongs to the Ovid Kochavim. Says the halacha, that's still ribis, because what you're doing is you're going through. Okay, the Ovid Kochavim is not chayv. There's no inyan of ribis, but you are really standing behind it. Even if you paid him back a chayv, you still can't do it. That's, in other words, the reach of ribis is strong, and you see what the halacha says, what the punishments are. That your nechasim will get less, and your kefir mitzias mitzrayim. So these are very strong things. Now, but one or two more halachas. Afilu im halove nosono yose midato b'shas hapiron. Even if the love gives him a little extra at the time he pays him, shelo titna imo ve'na omer shenosno yoseh b'shvil ribis oser. In other words, again, it turns out that even if the money wasn't specifically designated for ribis, but it's considered ribis. And we'll see in a minute what the other situation is. Imiu imlo hoyo mos biyodo derech halva. What happens if it was not derech halva, which we talked about in the Gemara, rak derech mecher, but it was extra money given to him through a mecher, a sale? Then we say that that is not considered ribis. So we had that in the Gemara as well. That in some, I mean, with the mandam of the Gemara, when it looked like he was okay in ribis, and says no, it's not okay, because if he gave it to him a derech mecher, even though later it may become a halva, but at the time of giving the money, it wasn't a loan, it was considered a sale. And the Gemara speaks that out. We have that. Now, one more. Afilu im omale b'shas lekichas haribis. Even when he gets the ribis, he says, "Ani noisna l'cho b'matana." Remember, we talked about a matana stam not being ribis, but if at the time he took the ribis, he's saying, "No, I'm giving you this money b'matana, also lekablo mimenu, you can't take it. Avim lokach mimenu ribis v'tzarich lachzuralo." Now, here's an interesting point. If he borrowed in ribis, okay, the Isser kind of already is in play, but he has to pay him back. But v'tzarich lahachziralo, but moelas mechila, the malve can be moichel. In other words, there's still an out at the end of this procedure that he can be moichel lepatro kumo b'chol gezel. In other words, he lent it to him with ribis, but when it came time to pay back, he says, Michael, you don't have to give me that extra few percentage points. So the halacha is he can still wiggle out of it. He can still wiggle out of it. Anyway, just these few halachas, because we talked last week about circumstances that there's a question whether there's ribis or not. And again, this goes on for multiple seifim, 20, 30 pages in the Yoredeya on Hilchas Ribis. But again, just the first few are a flavor of how stringent the halacha is. And we talked last week that a matana doesn't help if it's bishas at the time of the loan. But if he gives him a matana totally separate apart from this, then there is no isser because we're not going to associate necessarily the matana with the loan, and therefore there wouldn't be ribbis. But in any event, you see from the halacha how stringent we are, and to avoid it at all costs. And again,
Oh,
the difference between ribis d'oraisa, ribis d'Rabbanan. I mean, look, one shouldn't take ribis d'Rabbanan either. I mean, it's the point. But in the course of business, again, we see in the case where a person has a loan, he gives him a field for a mashkin, and then he eats from the fruit. These are all cases of ribis because you're benefiting from the relationship of the loan, but it's ribis drabanan because it's not the only ribis deraisa. And again, I think that's probably the Torah's way of saying we're going to be very stringent, but we're going to be very stringent only in a narrow band, only in a narrow circumstance. If it doesn't fall into that circumstance, then we won't consider it ribis deraisa. So that's kind of the out. Ribis is osir, but if you don't do it exactly the way the Torah says to do it, then it becomes ribis derabanan, and so we know ribis derabanan has less severity, and you don't have to pay it back and things of that nature.
all
All
right.
right. So that's
Before we get into the Gemara, Jay has the yort site and refuahs.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
He's muted. Jay's muted.
no, he's not muted. He's sounding like a chipmunk. We can't quite really hear you, Jay.
Yeah, we had that once before, I think.
Yeah, Jay, you might have to disconnect and reconnect. Um, it's coming out totally garbled.
Yeah.
So I says go ahead and disconnect and reconnect, and then we'll try again. All right. In the meantime, we can start for a minute.
Okay. So um, let's take a look and see exactly where we are.
How is this now?
Oh,
Oh,
better.
much better. There you go. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Rafua, three names. Chanabas Miriam,
Tanabas Miriam,
Yaakov ben Esther,
Yaakov ben Esther,
and Bluma Bas Enya.
Blumas Henya.
Yeah, and also today is the yahrzeit of Chani's father, my father-in-law, Yosef Meir ben Yaakov.
Yosef Meir ben Yaakov, the Shamash ben Aliyah.
Amen.
Again, the Refuah and the Shabbos Aliyah are all schusim for us, and especially as you know, we said the Tehillim, but in these very difficult times when Klal Yisrael is continues to suffer and continues to have you have to have great emunas Hashem because
Yeah,
everything else is dark.
yeah,
So sometimes we're put into a corner and we have no choice. So maybe this is that circumstance where, what do they say? There's no atheist in a foxhole.
yeah.
Sometimes you have no brayer to say, I have nowhere else to turn. I got to turn to God. So this is one of those moments, and the Baruch Shalom Shataka give us all the schusim to continue. All
Amen.
right.
Right.
Also,
So
good morning to Tzvi.
good morning. Yeah, see, I caught him. She was the first one on with me.
Okay,
All right. So now we're going to continue. Remember, we started the Mishnah where the Mishnah said that if someone lends money, then the sort of the ancillary benefits, if you will, of the loan might be that he will live in the Loves property for free or pay him less than market value. And the Torah says, I mean, the Mishnah says, but the Halacha says that that's ribbis. So we then gave a couple of cases to discuss that. And now, and we said there's two in Rab Nachman. There's one version on Iked Amrei. We won't go over all of that. So now we're going to give a different case on this Mishnah, and it starts Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama Tokif Avdo de Inche the Masik Behu Zizeh. It's about a little less than halfway down. Well, actually, it's a little bit more than halfway down. A little bit more than halfway down. Okay. Um, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's about 9 lines from the bottom. Okay, so now we're gonna see another case of what might be ribis and how that plays out. So in this particular case, Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama, an Amora, so he loaned money, and then he would take the eved, the servant of the love, and he would begin to work with him, and he would work with him. So the chayra on the face of it um, does not look like ribis. I mean, he's getting a benefit exactly how the Mishnah phrases it, that it's a benefit outside of the loan. The Mishnah was talking about living in someone's property, but someone's slave is the same thing. It's his property, and you're taking it sort of improperly. You're forcing yourself. And va'avad bu aveda, and he worked with it. He worked with the servant, so you see that he really got a direct benefit. All right, that was the case. Omale Rava B'nai. So Rava, who was the son of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama, said, "My tama ovid mar hachi." Okay, he was very careful not to, say something improper to his father, but he said, "Why does my master Mar do this?" In other words, how can you work with the slave that doesn't belong to you when it's tied to the love with whom you have a transaction of a loan? On Malay, so Rabbi Yosef said to him, "Anok Rab Nachman's really. I hold like Rab Nachman." Okay, what is Rab Nachman? Domer Rab Nachman, because Rab Nachman says, "Of the Nuhum Krisa lo shavi." So this is a fairly bold statement that Rab Nachman said that that a eved, a servant, is not lo shavi. He's not worth the food that you give him. In other words, you're paying him for service, but his work doesn't equal what you give him in food. So in other words, it's a lost leader. It's a lost leader because there's no benefit to having the slave. So in other words, since there's no benefit, and Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama came along and took the servant off the lover's hands. In other words, the lover wasn't using the servant. The servant was just sitting around, but he has to feed him. So he's certainly not getting the benefit of any work. Comes Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama and grabs the slave and starts working with him and gives him food. So l'chayra, there's no ribis here. If anything, it's the other way around. So the love, there's no benefit here. If anything, it's the other way around. So that's the explanation that Rabbi Yosef Bar Chama gave, because he holds like Nachman that a slave is sort of not worth the cost of what you feed him, and therefore, when someone takes it off his hands and feeds him, then he sort of, so there's no ribis. Okay, so that's the kasha and the teretz. Interesting. So
Rabbi,
yeah.
how can you assume that the work that the slave does has no value? Because all kinds of things he would ask him to do, lift up this package, that's a value. Maybe you can't create the monetary value theoretically, but he's using a slave to do things that he would have to hire somebody to do.
That's true, but the way the Gemara is casting it is that he's not getting a benefit. The malva is not getting a benefit by using the lover's servant. He's helping the lover by taking the servant off his hands for a period of time so that the lover doesn't have to feed him. Granted, it's going to be a benefit to the malva, no question about it. But the Rav Nachman holds that such a benefit is offset by having to feed him, so it's costing him more than the use of, picking up a package, do this for me, but I got to feed him. And according to this, the feeding is more than the service, in which case the malva is not getting a benefit. There's no benefit. right? So again, this is just the Havamina of the Gemara, Jay. We're not through the whole thing. But at this point, that would seem to be a good teretz, is that as a result of him feeding him, there is no real benefit, and therefore there's no ribbis. Okay, that's the scenario. Now we're not finished. Amalei, so Rava said to his father, Emed Amar Rab Nachman, you're quoting Rab Nachman, and you're saying based on Rab Nachman, there is no ribbis. Now, Rab Nachman, and there's another Gemara that Rab Nachman was known to have a slave by the name of Dari. So he said, you could go Dari Avde. He said, that's only Rab Nachman's situation because he has a servant by the name of Dari, Dimraket Bey Kove, um, who, aside from his work, and he didn't do much work, he went to the taverns and went to the beer halls, and he danced, right? The Moroccan, he danced, and he danced for wine, for drinks. In other words, you have someone who comes to a bar and he starts dancing, and they throw money at him, whatever the case may be. So Rava wants to say that you can't rely on Rab Nachman because Rab Nachman's situation where he says the servant is not worth the food, that's because he has Dari, and Dari didn't do any work. Dari was a slave. It's put down in another Gemara, maybe Bava Kama, that Dari was he basically was a drag on Rab Nachman. So taking Dari off his hands would taka be a mila because otherwise he's feeding him and Dari's not doing any work. He's running off to the bar. But Avde Echwina mi Omar. But did Rab Nachman mean to say that about any other slave who, like you say, Jay, he works and he does avoda, and the avoda is a benefit. It's a real benefit to the person. So in that case, the taka may be ribbis because the exception is dari, but that's not the rule. So that's what Rava said to him. So then Omalei, so Rabbi Yosef Nachman said back to his son, to Rava, Ani kahad Rab Daniel bar Ketino Amarav Svirale. So first I hang my hat on Rab Nachman. Now I'm going to hang my hat on Rab Daniel bar Ketina Amarav. What did he say? The Omar had toikif avdos chaverav osaba malacha potter. So he says beferish, Rav Katina. What does he say? Rav Daniel, what does he say? He said, if you use the servant of someone else and you work with him. Now, what's the caveat here? He says the caveat is that the owner is not using the servant. In other words, I have a slave and a servant, and I work with him, but there's downtime. So he took him during the downtime. Clearly, if he had taken him when the loiva needed him and he used him, that would be a different circumstance. But if he takes him when there's no other work to be had, and he works for him, then he doesn't have to pay. In other words, there's no ribbis. Because if you take the slave, and you basically that will be considered ribbis. But because there is downtime, he's not using him. So the fact that Rabbi Yosef took him, Rabbi Nachman took him, Rabbi Choma took him, is not considered ribbis. So what do we learn from this? I mean, we learn that again, ribbis, you have to look at it from all angles, and certainly it might look like ribbis. Why? Because he gave him a loan, and then he starts using his servant and doesn't pay him. That would be exactly what the Mishnah says, right? Lo yida b'chatzero, he shouldn't take the benefit of his chatzer or discount. All these things are improper. So l'chara, using his evidence is also improper, says the Gemara, and this is the case of Rabbi Daniel bar Katina. He says that in the particular case where it's not being used, then it's potter. You don't have to pay him. So again, you see another exception to ribbis is the case where why? Because we say zenenev zelo chaser. In other words, which we talked about the other weeks as well. that the competing interest of Zenen and Zelo Chaser obviates ribis.
And Rabbi,
Yeah,
what's interesting is in the first part of the discussion, it talked about how the work the slave was doing was not equal to being fed. Here they don't talk about the feeding, but the other benefit to the slave owner is he's not missing work because the slave owner doesn't have any work for him, and somebody else is feeding him.
that's right.
So there is that added benefit
Right.
that the person's getting.
Right, but he originally he wanted to slug up Rav Nachman because he says you can't put your circumstance of Dari in,
Right,
compared
right,
to everybody else.
right,
So he wanted to say Dari is miyuchad, but every other
right.
servant is different. Comes this man to Omer Rav Daniel Bar Katima and says no. Even by other servants, there's an okay here, but the circumstance has to be where there is no work. Because if there's work, that changes the
Got it.
equation. That changes the equation. But if there's no work and he's using him, then it becomes Zen Chasa, which is midas stom. So we say that under those circumstances, you're allowed to use him. But again, so the question may be that oftentimes we're worried about Marasayan. So if someone doesn't know the particular circumstance that he took the servant to work with him just because the lova had no work for him, other people may not appreciate that. And so l'chara, from their standpoint, they may think it's ribis, but lahaloch it's not ribis. So the question then becomes, how do you distinguish yourself to let it sort of be known that what you're doing is proper, and it's not ribis. So I don't know, maybe a clap and tish in the shulchan in the shul, and you say, I'm using Yosef's servant, but it's okay. Again, it's the finer nuances of here. We don't say it's ribis, not even midrabanan, because zenen and zelachasa. Okay. Okay. Denichale dalanistre avde. So this is also a benefit to the lover. Why? Because by using him, it's kind of like, when someone is in use, then he continues to be in use. He says, the Lanistre Avde, he shouldn't become lazy. In other words, if he's going to get a day off, he's going to think, oh, I'm entitled to a day off. Therefore, by working him on the day when the lova is not working him, that's another benefit. It is a benefit because he's now continuing to work the servant, so the servant doesn't have any ideas. He doesn't say, oh, I can slough off, I don't have to work as hard. Okay, so it's an interesting exchange. And we see that again, it's not mineral rice, it's not ribis. I don't even know that it was avak ribis, because midrabanan, because really there are distinguishing factors. Now, so the story doesn't end. Omale, so Rava then says to his father, Hanemile heche de lo masik behu zuze. You know when you can do this and it's considered okay when there's no. Now he's going to the heart of the matter. He says, "Heicha de lo masik bezuza." When there's no owing any money, then okay, that's what he meant by saying you can take it and it's not considered theft. It's not considered anything because it's a benefit, right? But Mar, meaning Rabbi Yosef, given the masik bezuze machzi, since he holds a loan over him, then it looks like ribis. So again, we're talking about not the ribis deraisa, but ribis drabanan. So Rava wants to distinguish that which Rabbi Yosef ben Kadima was talking about, Daniel ben Kadima was talking about, was stam a case of you took someone's servant, you started working with him, and there's nothing wrong because you're helping him out. But, and this is Rava saying, but you can't apply that because Rabbi Yosef Bar Kadima does not say specifically that it works by a loan. Rabbi Yosef Bar Kadima's statement was that if I come to you and I use your servant in the off hours, it's okay. Like you said, Yale, because you're feeding him, but also you're keeping him busy so that he won't be lazy. But it doesn't say anything about a loan. So therefore, Rabbi Yosef asks his father, how can you do it? You're relying on Rabbi Daniel Bar Kadima, which doesn't talk about a loan. Hanimile de lo masik bezuze, when there was no case of a loan and he owed him money. All right, but given the masik bezuze, Mexico ribis. Now we're back to square one. Since you're taking it on the back of a loan, even though there may be these distinguishing factors, like we just said, right? He benefits from him because he feeds him and other things, but it's machze karibis. It's avak ribis because it looks like ribis. So how do you get out of that
But Rabbi, it's
dilemma?
Yale. Sorry to interrupt, but if there's no loan involved, then what's the issue? The whole issue I thought here is, there's a loan involved and you're using the person's slave. Then is that a benefit or not? But if we're not talking about an underlying loan, we're simply you have a slave and he's not working right now, and I say, you know what? If you don't mind, I'm going to take him. I'm going to take him and help him build my sukkah, and I'll feed him. Where's the issue there if there's no underlying loan between the two of us?
Okay, but he took him without the
Oh,
permission of the lover. Now
oh,
let's go back to the
okay.
Mishnah a minute. The Mishnah talked about someone who made a loan, and then he used the other, and then the other. Well, okay, so he used the loan. The lover went into Eretz Yisrael, and he went ahead and he took one of his apartments. He used one of his apartments. Fine, so that's forbidden. But
Without permission.
without permission. But so we extract from the Mishnah that without permission, without the loan, is okay. In other words, we're extrapolating from the Mishnah. Yes, the Mishnah is talking about halva, but so we want to say agavurcha. In the case of no halva, it's okay. So Rav Daniel Bakatina is talking about the agavurcha. He's talking about a case where the slave wasn't working and you came along and you used him. You didn't ask permission or whatever, and now you're using him. So the lover really is getting a benefit. So there's no improper taking or anything like that. But says Rava up to his father, if there was a loan involved, then look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that he shouldn't use his apartment or take it at a discount. Isn't that what you're doing here? He says to his father. You're taking the benefit of the slave. You want to give me a teretz because you're feeding him, but that really is directly what the Mishnah is saying, right? That you shouldn't do. So now how are you relying on Rav Daniel Bar Katima when his situation was different than the situation that we're talking about? That's the kasha. Um, all right. So, again,
The same thing would apply if he borrowed his car when he went to Eretz Yisrael.
so we're saying Shalom Midas, right? There was no loan involved, right?
No, there is a loan involved.
Okay. So if there's a loan involved and then he uses his car without letting him know, then that's exactly what the Mishnah says. Mishnah says that lo yoder b'chotzer chinam, he should not live for free, or i.e., he shouldn't borrow the car or use the car, because again, this is not miribis deraisa, but he's saying there is ribis because it looks like you're getting the benefit of the free car because you made the loan.
But
Even the
sometimes somebody wants, I want you to start up my car and use it.
right,
You wait
right,
for a couple of months.
right.
Doing a favor to the
But that's the case of the servant. The case of the servant is he's doing him a favor by feeding him or making him work so that he knows work is he's got to work. He can't take days off. So that's the same as starting the car. I mean, because basically he's getting a benefit, right? He's getting a benefit. You're saying the lover is getting a benefit because he's helping him out, but once that's in any way attached to the loan, then the issur of the loan outweighs the benefit to the lover. In other words, the lover, yes, it's a benefit, but since it's on the back of a loan, that's what makes it Marasayan, that's what makes it
but if
Avakribis.
they're both very close friends, they would do these things for each other anyway without a loan being involved in the story. It's they're neighbors, right?
Yeah.
So he needs to borrow.
Okay, so stamazoi, it wouldn't be a problem. I go into your car, you didn't give me permission, but I turned it on to
Yeah,
make it good. Those are all valid things that we say that he's providing him a benefit. And look, between you and I, stamazoi, for me to be a good guy and to help you or vice versa,
yeah.
has nothing to do. It's once there is a loan in play that we are worried about this whole, and as I quoted from the halacha is so sensitive to the fact that a loan in play changes the whole scenario of anything you might do that is a chesed, is a good deed. It changes it. It
But
really
you
changes.
but you have to have somebody watching. I mean, you need to.
Right, right. No,
I
no,
mean,
no. Watching is the problem, Maris Iron. If
yeah.
nobody were watching, you and I would just, it was just you and I, the halacha says that it's still a ribis derabanan, even though it won't have an effect on anybody else, because it's, in other words, just between you and I, we shouldn't do it. So, in other words, there is a lesson to be learned that you and I have to be careful, even though someone else might not be around to see it, so there wouldn't be a question of Marasayan, but there's still between us, there's still, in other words, you're not exempt because no one else sees it. If anybody else sees it, it just adds a layer to the problem, right? Because someone else is seeing it and it's Marasayan. But we wouldn't say that just because no one saw it, that the halacha should be forgiven. That's not the case.
But
So,
if somebody sees him borrowing his neighbor's car
right.
and he doesn't know about the loan,
Right, exactly. Then that would be a case of where he wouldn't know, so he would think he's doing it with permission, and that's the from our Mishnah, the exemption is without a loan. If I go in and I live in your dira, who's going to know that I'm doing something right or wrong? Therefore, you can't extract ribbis from that. Now, if let's say I know that Shimon never leases out his place or never gives his place out, he doesn't want anybody to use his place. Shimon goes to Eretz Yisrael, comes along Reuven, no loan, no loan. Reuven comes along and he squats. He comes into the apartment and he wants to be there. All right. Now Yehuda's out there watching and he says, "What's going on over here? Why is Reuven coming into Shimon's apartment? That's not right." So that's a different question. So that there, arguably, I mean, the halacha says it's okay, but you could argue, wait a minute, there's some marasayan here, or there's something going on here, because as a bystander, I know that Shimon never gives out his property, but it doesn't rise to the level of ribbis. In other words, yeah, okay, is it okay to do it? Yes, it's okay to do it. The fact that someone sees it and is going to be concerned, all right, we're not we say we're not makbid on that, or maybe he has to clarify I'm doing this because he's a friend. But our focus is on ribbis, and we're saying that in the case where there's no halvo attached to it, doing something that might otherwise give rise to a question, am I doing something properly, isn't an isser. There's no isser involved. So that's the way we have to answer. That's what we have to answer. Okay. Um,
but it seems like it's hard to write a handbook of rules of what you can and cannot do in these situations where the loan is not known to others and it's a private loan, nobody knows about it. And it can look one way, it can look another way. You just can't resolve when the neighbor downstairs doesn't understand why are you going into the apartment upstairs.
right.
So you can't really. It's hard to put down straight rules for
You know,
anybody to
you know
follow.
what? You're right, but I have a feeling that what the Gemara, it doesn't say it, but what the Gemara is really talking about is that um, we're, we're living in a time here, in the time of the Gemara, where people would help each other out, and in a stam situation without any strings attached, there is no hakpada. There is no being makbid, being particular. If someone uses my possession without asking me, It's the classic case of Zenan of Zelochasa. In other words, people are open without permission to letting someone else use it because it doesn't affect me. That's what permeates this scenario, I believe. Is may not be the case today where people don't like to do that, but certainly in the time of the Gemara, it seemed like that was a normal thing to do, that people would if I'm not using it, you can use it, right? It's no skin off my nose. Now, of course, you have to maintain it, you have to make sure it's clean and all those other things. We get that. But to deny him the use of it when I'm not using it, that's already a little sketchy because that's made us know.
Mm.
So I think that's the scenario we're living under. So therefore, um, someone watching wouldn't think anything was, there was no ulterior, there was no motive here. He's doing what everybody else does. Shimon went to Eretz Yisrael. He's not using it. Reuven knows it. Reuven wants to be in that part of town for Shabbos, so he camps into the apartment and he's there for Shabbos. No one's going to think twice. I mean, that's what we have to assume here, that was the nature of how people operated. So,
But Rabbi, by the same token, this is what bothers me.
yeah.
By the same token, the essence is you're trying to do something to help someone and you don't want to broadcast it. So if I'm making a loan to someone, I don't want to embarrass that person to understand that they have to borrow because they may have a need and they can't afford it. And yet we're worried about how people perceive that. In the essence is we're supposed to help our fellow Jew to do whatever they need to do. So we're acting here on what the perception of somebody else is, where they may not know, or they should not know, because if we're doing it right, we should be helping someone without letting them know that they are unable or they can't. And so all this is because a suspicious mind is, as Morris Ian is perceiving that this person is getting a benefit that they're not entitled to. It wipes out the essence of what we're supposed to be doing. And I just don't understand how it undermines the essence of what we're supposed to be doing to our fellow man.
Right. So this is an interesting question. So now we have, on the one hand, as you want to state correctly, there's a zed nenev zelo chaser, that I should be helping you because I don't need it. You have a benefit for it, and the halacha says zed nenev zelo chaser is something that you should definitely provide. But up against that, okay, so in the normal circumstance, there's no question that that is the appropriate thing to do. However, and again, the bystander may or may not have known this, the halacha tells us that this very powerful provision of zenen v'zelo chaser does not come into play. In other words, it's not something that has legs, as kiyum, in the case of a loan. In the case of a loan, then the Isser of Ribis wipes away the provision of Zenen of Zelochaser. In other words, it's stronger. Ribis is stronger than the presumption of Zenen of Zelochaser. Now, to the casual observer who doesn't know anything, but he lives in a time when we know that people let other people use their possession without necessarily letting them know, because that was the norm, and it's Zenen of Zelochaser. So he won't be the wiser. Now, if I lend you money and then you go and live in it, you're right. There's no maris ayin necessarily, because the casual bystander is not going to know that this circumstance has a loan attached to it and is different than any other case of a squatter coming in and living. So Maris Ayin may not apply, but the halacha still is you can't do it because of ribbits. So I think you're concerned maybe for the observer, right? So the observer won't know the difference of someone squatting if there is a loan or if there's not a loan.
Well, I'm concerned about the person who is lending, because essentially, if you lend someone money, you are changing your relationship with that
Correct.
person.
Right. Everything is off limits. Right.
So you can't do anything else. You cannot take anything from that person. You cannot borrow something from that person because it will be perceived as you're
Ribbis
taking advantage of the lending
of the
situation
lending
and
circumstance.
abusing
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
So when you make a loan to someone, which we're supposed to do to help our brother, our Jewish brother, we can't do anything else for them because it really says that's it. And so my alternative is to say, if I want to continue to have the relationship I had with you, I better arrange for someone else to loan to you rather than me, because then it takes me out of that equation. So if
That's
my
correct.
neighbor, so it just seems to be, I understand that it is protecting against someone taking advantage, which is worse. By the same token, it's meaning you can't help a person even more. And it's saying that our presumption of human nature of a Jew who believes in God is that they're going to abuse that privilege of a loan, and so therefore don't you can't do anything else for them. You've done everything with a loan, but now you have to get out of the way because anything else would be perceived, and you may be subject to taking advantage of that person.
Right. Right. And Hanami. So your point is that if I'm a good guy and I want to keep a certain arm's length relationship with you, that you can use my possessions, I don't want to be difficult, then the question is, can I then go ahead and borrow from you? And the answer is no, you have to make a choice. Either I borrow the money from you, you help me that way. Because remember, a loan without ribbis is a very big thing. I'm giving you a helping hand. I'm giving you a helping hand because you need the money right now. So that helping hand, so to speak, trumps the any other chesed that the lover may want to give the borrower at the time during the time of the loan, because the halacha tells us it's ribbis. You're 100% right. Again, it's ribbis to rabbanon, and that doesn't make it better, but it makes it less of a onerous circumstance because that doesn't require repaying or anything. You shouldn't intentionally do ribbis d'rabbanan. I'm not saying you should, but if you do, then okay, it's a slap on the wrist and you go find it. But to your point, you're correct that the relationship changes. The Torah tells us that the relationship changes. Now, the halacha, I mean, we see it in other circumstance where a person might not want to lend somebody else because you're right, the whole equation of our relationship changes, and I feel uncomfortable by it. And as you know what happens, I loan you money, you're late in paying. I don't want to be a bad guy, so I don't say anything to you. Now our relationship may sour because I expected the money back. You haven't been able to pay me back. So the whole equation of our relationship has changed because of the loan. Got it.
So,
Absolutely.
Rabbi, that popped into my head as I was discussing this. Is that why we have in communities the Hebrew Free Loan
Yes,
Association
yes.
and Gemach, so that people don't have to be
Have
beholden to a person, but to a
correct.
community? And is that
Correct.
the way around?
Absolutely correct. Also, it's not uncommon for people who donate to a free society, free loan society, to do it
Anonymously,
beseser, without for that very
without ascription. Yep.
without a scripture. For that very reason that there shouldn't be any sort of. Now, if I give that to a free loan society, they're free to do what they want, right? They can lend it over as. I am no longer attached to that loan, so I don't know. Now, Shimon goes to Eretz Yisrael, and I want to use his apartment, which is the normal thing to do. Now I can do it because I wasn't in direct contact with the loan to him. That was my donation or my whatever, even my loan to the loan society. Let's say I lend it to the
But
loan.
it's not a loan to the loan society. Isn't it a gift to the loan society?
So normally it is, but let's say, hypothetically, I go to the loan society and I say, I know you're under great stress, that you need money. So I'm going to lend you the money without interest to the loan society. I mean, let's take it a step further. If he gives it, Bechlal, there's no problem. But what happens if he lends it to the loan society? Now the loan society has free reign to do whatever it wants. It now gives a loan to Shimon. He gives a loan to Shimon. Reuven isn't, in other words, Reuven is not in the nexus of that loan because he gave a loan to the society to give him back whenever. He didn't dictate to the society, give it to Shimon, give it to Levi, give it
He
to you.
doesn't know about the Shimon even.
Say what?
He may not even know about
He may not
Shimon.
even know about it,
Right.
which is why that takes him out of the equation to not be able to have a helping hand if Shimon goes to Eretz Yisrael and he wants to use the apartment. So what?
He
Right?
doesn't know
The
about the
halacha tells
deal.
us you can do that.
He doesn't know about the
He
loan.
doesn't know about it. Exactly right. But the point that I want to make to Michael is it doesn't necessarily have to be a gift. It can even be a loan, which at some point in time, the Free Society is going to pay back. Again, there may be open terms. Whenever you have the money, give it back to me. But there's no nexus between the malve and the love, and therefore it's permitted. So that takes a different equation. But here that's not the situation. So now, okay, so this is what Rava says to his father is that this whole hypothesis was only but that it was an open situation. But once it's not an open situation, then how can you say now, so Rava says to his father, the Omer of Yosef Bar Minyomi. Now we're quoting different Amorim to try to hang his hat, and he says, Rabbi Yosef Bar Minyomi, Omer of Nachman, Afal Pisha Omru. Even though we say, in other words, this is the rule, Hador b'chotza chavero shalom medato, and it's lahalos lo schar. That if a person, going back to square one, if a person uses the chotzer of someone shalom medato, no money, no loan, nothing involved. Simply, the guy went to Eretz Yisrael, left his possessions. Shimon, Reuven comes along and says, Shimon's house is empty. I want to be here for Yontif. I'm coming and I'm going to be here. Right? It's so we want to make the point that there's no Isser. Ain't it tzorach la'os lo schar? Why? Because that's zenenev zelo chaser. That's exactly the case of zenenev zelo chaser. And we're assuming there's no chisaron. Remember, this is a little bit nuanced because if the guy's going to come in with 8 children and he's going to make a mess and leave, then it's not zenenev zelo chaser because then he's doing him a disservice by living there. But this Rava speaking. But Rabbi Yosef Bar Yomi says halvov derech batzero. If you make a loan and then want to live in his apartment, tzorich lahalos lo schar. Then he has to pay him rent, and he can't get a discounted rent either, says the Mishnah, because then it's attached to ribbis. So again, yes, we're saying that that a loan is a big factor in changing the equation between two people. And now we have to balance ribbis against zenenev zelo chaser, or in other words, we have to balance it out, and we say ribbis overtakes that. Ribbis is the greater has the greater position here. But certainly in a case like you said, Michael, where it's not a direct, yes, the Torah encourages to lend. So we're doing what the Torah wants, but at the same time, the Torah is telling you once you lend, now you're off limits with the guy for anything else. So yes, it would seem like that's an unfair thing because here I'm a good guy and I want to lend. Now the lover wants to do a good for me, and that good for me is going to look like ribbis. So the Torah says, yes, the relationship that you've created, Pina Malva and Lova, does in fact inhibit you from doing other things, which is why, and again, your example is a good one, that you find a way for the loan not to be your loan. Now, you can't remember last week we talked about an orev, we talked about a guarantor. And so here you have to be careful. because if the guarantor is going to be liable and then the guarantor is going to go back to the love, that's ribis. In other words, just because the guarantor is paying me the money and not the love, that only works when the guarantor pays it and the relationship between the love and the guarantor is there's no payment due. Then you're paying the guarantor, and it's like I'm giving you money, not necessarily for a matana, but I'm paying you money, either because for goodwill or whatever else. But once that orev, that guarantor is attached to the love, then it's no better than the love giving me ribis. So in other words, you have to be very careful. That was your point last week, that with the guarantor, and that's what the halacha that I read from the Ordea is, that even the guarantor has to have sort of an arm's length relationship here, so as not to appear that it's a way of cheating or getting around ribis, because you're borrowing to him and you're getting paid by him. Yeah, but what about the orev and the love? Yeah,
But
if that relationship.
the guarantor, if the relationship is between the malva and the guarantor, and the lova doesn't know about that, that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
But once the lova is brought into the equation, then it's not okay.
Right, because once love is brought into the equation, then you know that the orev is going to go to the lover, right? So what have you accomplished? Instead of getting paid by the lover, you're getting paid by the orev, and the orev is going to go to the lover and request the money. So it's still ribis with a different bow.
Not necessarily. If the agreement is that the orave goes to the malva but doesn't go to the lova.
Oh, that's my point. If he doesn't go to the lover, then you're right. But if he's going to go to the lover, then it's kind of sleight of hand, because you're maneuvering around it, but it's still going to be ribis. So in other words, we're watching you, says the Torah. Don't do things that are improper. And then even if it isn't midaraisa, the Rabbanan are saying don't do things that are improper. But again, it's hard to say. It's hard to say that if a person borrows money, no ribbis, no agreed ribbis, and then he allows someone to use his possession free or for a discount, then we're saying that's improper. It's ribbis drabanan. Okay, it's ribbis drabanan, no question. The question, Michael, would be if the guy absolutely needs a place to live, and the lover in this case allows him to live there because of a chesed that he wants to do. That chesed might be ribis d'Rabbanan, but it's still a chesed to the other guy, and that's what makes it very, very difficult, because he realizes that if he doesn't allow him to stay there, it's not a case where it's a convenience. He needs a place, otherwise he's sleeping in the street. So
But Rabbi, if he agreed to say, I'm going to lend you money in exchange for you're able to stay in my residence, if that's a transaction, that's a legal transaction. That would be consideration, not a loan. It would be consideration for one chesed to another chesed.
Please get out of here, please.
right, but in essence, we're saying that that's prohibited, because the loan should stand alone. Should stand by itself. The loan should not be tied to any other event.
But that's not a loan. That is I'm going not lend you money. I'm going to give you money in exchange for your living there. If it's reasonable, that's an exchange. It's a sale.
But Michael, isn't that what the Mishnah is saying? Hamalvis chavero, I lend you money, right? I lend you money.
Lend.
Lo yider b'chatzero b'chinam. You should not live in my premises for free. Yeah, it's okay. It's a chesed. Fine, call it a chesed. But it still appears to be ribis. Now, this is ribis drabanan, because it's not ribis deraisa.
But if it's not a loan, if he says, I'm going to give you a sum of money, in return, you're going to live in my place, you take the loan away. And so you can accomplish it as an exchange, a transaction. where there's one chesed for another chesed, but it is in a transaction. So you don't have an obligation to pay me. You're, back for the loan, but I'm going to live on you in your premises during this time because I have nowhere to live.
Okay. Now, in your scenario, is that the payback for the loan?
It's not a loan. It's a payback for its consideration for the money you gave me. It's like a sales transaction
Oh,
where
so again, so you use the magic word. How do we treat this money? Remember, if you're treating it as whatever you treat as a sale is not ribbis. And
right,
we've had this in different circumstances in the Gemara where we say that if a person gets a mashkin of a field and he eats the fruit, we consider it as if he was sold him the property, and later when he comes back, he's going to sell it back to him. So that was kind of a workaround from ribbis. So what's the excuse here? I gave you 100. How did I give you the $100? What, a matana? I gave you a matana?
well, it could be a matana, or it could be just
No, if it's a matana,
as long as you don't characterize it as a
it's a loan. Right.
it is permissible. So you could do it by taking out the loan from the equation and say, I'm paying you this amount of money, stay in my house.
Okay, that could be a straight rental, or it could be a matana from a matana.
Right.
A matana from a matana has no ribbis attached.
Right. So that's how you would get around.
Yeah, because but there's no payback. In other words, you can use my apartment for the
there is a payback, but the payback is you can use my apartment in exchange for giving you money.
That's the point. Give him the apartment, but then he doesn't have to pay back that $100.
Right. So that's how you take that.
That's a totally
out of the equation.
That's a totally different situation. Correct. Though that kind of situation would work. Yeah, that would work because there's no loan attached. Once you use the term loan, then you open up a can of worms. What can I do that it wouldn't be considered improper ribbis, the deraisa, the rabbanon, however you want to couch it.
Well, once it's a loan, all bets are off.
But it sounds like he's renting the place.
What, Jay?
It sounds like a rental.
That's what it is. That he's converting
it's a rental.
A rental is not. No, there's no ribbis involved.
That's exactly the point. If it's going to be my $100 for living in the apartment, that's okay. But, so let me think a minute. In that circumstance, where I give you $100 and you allow me to live in your apartment, that's fine. Now, there's no loan involved, so it doesn't.
It's a rental.
It's a rental. Now, would it matter if I'm letting you stay in the apartment? The apartment really costs $200 a night, but I'm letting you stay for $100 a night
because you've done a rental.
So right, so that's the question. He gave him a matana. He gave him money. He says, "Okay, now do me a favor. It's no loan. You don't owe me anything. I'd like to stay in your apartment." And he says, "Okay." Now the apartment may be worth $200 a night, but he says, "Okay, you can stay in the apartment." That would be okay only because there's no rental, there's no loan involved.
No loan.
Once you use that term, in other words, what we're saying, we're being very makpid that you can't use the term halva, you can't use the term loan in association with anything that will transact between these two people. And that's really what the Gemara is saying. So Rava says to his father, how can you say what you're doing? Rav Yosef Bar Rav Nachman says beferish hadar b'chatzachaverev shalom midato ein etzorach lalos lo schar. That everybody agrees that you don't have to give him schar because there's no consideration. Halva v'dar b'chatzero, but once you include a loan and then he lives in the courtyard, tzorach lalos lo schar, then he has to pay him schar, otherwise it's ribbis. So you know what? Comes Rabbi Yosef, he says to his son, Hadrabe, I changed my my view, and I will not do it. I won't do it again. In other words, he was doing it. Rava only asked him. He asked his father, "How are you doing it?" And he wanted to squirm away and say, "Yeah, look, it says that if someone lends bechinam, it's okay." So Rava sort of drills down on it, and there was a back and forth, and yet he says basically Mar Abba. He says, we can't get around this. If you are not attached to him in any way, fine. But once you're attached with the halva, then it can no longer be a relationship of even zenen of zelo chaser because it's all tied to the loan. And again, this is just the Gemara is re-emphasizing what we've already said since the beginning of this parak, is that a loan between two people changes the dynamic of the relationship. And I know, Michael, you've asked a couple of times, yeah, but still, does that mean that someone shouldn't be nice to somebody else? And the answer is that, he has to take that niceness and give it to somebody else and say, you do the chesed. I can't do the chesed because of the loan. That's how far the Torah is telling us that you should avoid ribbis, is that other chasadim, other things that you would otherwise do between yourselves, now cast the shadow of ribbis, even ribbis drabanan, and you shouldn't do it. Now, it's not to say that if you do it, again, lechatchila, certainly you shouldn't do it. If b'diavad you do it and it's ribbis drabanan, all right. I mean, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that there is a difference between ribbis deraisa and ribbis derabanan. Ribbis deraisa, there's no tshuva according to Rav Nachman. I mean, there's no way of getting around it. But ribbis derabanan, not only do you, I mean, you shouldn't do it, and you don't owe him the money. You don't have to repay money that you took ribbis derabanan. That goes to show you that at least the Rabbanan should say pay back. No, you don't even have to pay back the money. That's how far it goes. But, and if you sort of, skirt around that issue, you have to just understand that, you're not losing Olam Haba because you did it.
Yeah.
That's the
But
point.
I think Michael is really coming down to a bottom line lesson. All the goodness that you should do with your neighbors, your friends, your relatives,
Right.
you do good, do all the things, lend them the lawnmower. Now, if the lawnmower is not running right and he takes it to get it serviced and brings it back, it's still not a loan. He was responsible for the maintenance of the lawnmower when he borrowed it. So the whole trick is stay away from any kind of loan with people without understanding
yeah.
that and being sure in your mind that it can't be converted into a ribbis situation.
Right. But that very much is to the point that Michael brought up, is that when we have these kinds of circumstances, then we should use the option of matnas b'seiser or even halva b'seiser and give it to a third party so that I'm not connected, and they can give it to Reuven, Shimon, Levi. I don't know. I don't know where it's going. So if I go to you, Stamazai, and borrow your lawnmower, I didn't know that the Free Society gave you a loan for my money. I don't know that. So we're not going to say because I gave the money and they're going to lend it to someone who I might transact with, that makes me over ribbis. No, it doesn't make you over ribbis because you did it with an arm's length, and that's really is the answer. So the answer is that in Jewish society, it's better. It's better for Reuven and Shimon not to directly deal with a loan, unless, of course, again, today we do shtoris, we do other things that kind of circumvent that, so that it shouldn't be considered a loan. Or it's not considered ribbis because there's a fee and whatever you call that, a user fee, whatever it is. So today the halacha has given us some options, but your situation, your reference is really on point. Is that loans in Jewish society should really be not between two direct people, but it should really be through an entity that guarantees secrecy, so that any other transaction or chesed that I want to do with someone isn't considered improper because it hangs on the loan. That really is the bottom line here, that Rava is pointing out to his father, and his father says, "You're right."
Rabbi, if someone asked me for a loan and I have a mitzvah as a Jew if I can do it to help them. If I do that through another mechanism, have I transgressed, or have I done the mitzvah anyway to avoid having a direct loan? What's
Okay.
more important?
Right. So when you ask that question, the question should, the first answer is, you know what? I know that the Free Loan Society is making loans. Why don't you go to them? And I remember talking to a Rav who was dealing with this because people always came to him, and that was his answer. Now, in the back of his mind, he probably knew that people were donating to that loan society for the point of matna b'seser, which is really the way to give tzedakah, is you give it b'seser, you don't give it directly to the person in need. The same with the halva. It uncomplicates what would otherwise be a complicated situation by going to that third party. Now, if if you gave the money to the third party to give to the borrower, that's a problem. That's a problem because what you're doing is you're lending it to him through a conduit. What you have to really do is go to that third party with a condition. I'm giving you money, even if it's a loan, or I'm giving you a gift. Whatever. Okay, even with a loan, we said before, I'm lending you this money, and at some point you'll pay me back. I'm not holding you feet to the fire. You don't have to do it next week. Now I've made a loan to the Free Society. Again, once they have the money and they lend it to Shimon, and at a later point you come to Shimon and you want to use his apartment or his car, whatever the case may be, that's the breaks the nexus so that there shouldn't be an appearance of ribis, and therefore it's done. And I think again, that's the halacha. The halacha really is that you want to avoid that ribis circumstance, and one of the ways to do it is through this mechanism that you point out. Another way to do it, of course, is with the star that we have today, which allows for ribbish heteriska, is you go to a Rav and he writes up a star, which the language of the star is made to avoid ribbis. That's what the heteriska is. If we can get a copy, we can look at it. But the point is that you're taking it out of the sort of the arena of ribbis into something else. And that something else allows you to continue to operate between us in every other manner, right? I could lend you this, or I can sell you that, or whatever the case may be. So that's again, Rava wanted to show to his father that what he was saying was really not correct, and he brought down different manda amrim, and at the end of the day, his father said, "You're right. You're right. That no matter how you slice it, once there is a loan in play, everything else is suspect, and therefore you can't jump in and say, all right, I'm going to give you this this discount, or you can use my apartment, whatever the case may be." So again, no question about it. Ribis trumps the day, that it changes the equation for everything. All right. So Mitshem will pick up from here. Again, we're still in the same parsha, but again, we're seeing more and more that how ribis controls your life. And therefore, the way, again, Heter Iskub was not something they had in the time of the Gemara. So you really, at the time of the Gemara, had to be super careful. I'm not even, I don't know, maybe they had Free Loan Society. I don't know what they had. If they had, where presumably they did, where you can donate and let another society give you the money. But otherwise, it becomes a problem. Just as a footnote to this, I know in one circumstance where a person lent money to somebody else. Clearly, it was a loan, and he never got it back. So he went to the person and said, I lent you money, and it was not bishtar. There was no written shtar. He says, I lent you money. You should really repay me. So the fellow, the borrower, then said, I didn't think that you lent me money. I thought that you gave me a gift of this money. In other words, whether it was right or not, he was saying to him in so many words that what we did, what we transacted was not a halva, and therefore our relationship shouldn't change for any other purpose because you gave me a matana. Now, is it right? Is it not right? That wasn't the way the parties, at least from the lender's point of view, that's not what he intended. But there was no shtar, there was no written contract that said it to be able to prove it. So I know that in that particular case, the lender said, "Okay, I'm Michael," so that there should be no outstanding loan that is not being paid, which is that's an avera. I mean, if I lend you money, you have to repay me, otherwise it could be considered gezela. So he went so far, and he says, "I'm not getting money back from this guy. I know he's not paying me, but so I'm going to be Michael, and I'm going to say it was a matana." But again, I know that circumstance, and that's a case where the lender was, he was a pious man, and he knew that if he didn't forgive him, that loan would be on the books, and that the relationship would totally change. So he didn't want to be in that circumstance. So I don't know how big the sum was. It wasn't, I mean, it was a good sum, but he wanted not to have that circumstance hanging over his head. So he says, "Okay, I'm giving it to you, but matana." So, but again, I think between buyer and seller, you're right. It's a mitzvah in the Torah, but there's no question it changes the dynamic between the parties, and that's something you have to that the Torah tells us. Yes, even though the Torah wants you to be about chesed, but you can't be about chesed when you've borrowed money because that chesed is going to look like ribbis. So it's a clash of two mitzvahs, Michael. There's no question. The mitzvah of doing chesed and the mitzvah of lending money. The lending money is also a chesed. If I lend you money, it's a chesed, but that's a chesed that I have to keep separate and can't then now come back for a benefit, even though you want to do me a chesed. You want to do me a chesed. You want to do me a good turn. Okay, you're going to have to postpone the good turn until our previous relationship is corrected. Then I'll do you a chesed. All right. So we'll stop here, Mitzvah Shem.